Hey guys, it's me Balfam here, and today I thought I'd make an updated video on if it's too late to start Honkai Impact, because that video actually got quite a lot of views for what I consider is a pretty bad video, and I think there's a lot more nuance to this topic that I want to talk about. So to put it into perspective, I've been playing since 2018. I had a C account for a year before the NA account that I use now. So I've seen what Honkai Impact used to be as well as what it is now, and I have a few opinions about how the game has become. So I think the most important aspect of Honkai Impact for new players is probably the meta. How easy is it to get into the meta? And the answer is it's actually extremely easy. In fact, much easier compared to back then. I like to pull up this picture a lot from Mercy Honkai, but it's a 7.3 tier list. And as you can see, you'd have to build a lot of Valkyries just to cover all 4 teams. Whereas in part 2 of Honkai Impact, you can simply just build 4 to 6 Valkyries and you'll cover all elements. Maybe not optimally, but you'll still be able to cover all elements. And the reason for this is because all Valkyries in part 2 function as both DPSs and supports, and they work synergistically with each other. It's like if Casterus in Honkai Star Rail was a DPS, support DPS, and an amplifier all at the same time. So if you for some reason had all these 5 Valkyries built and fully geared, you'd literally cover all 4 elemental types and probably be able to place into the top 2 percentile of Memorial Arena, as well as get in Red Lotus for Abyss. Now, building 5 Valkyries might sound really hard on paper, but actually it's extremely easy. Patches are 9 weeks long now instead of 6 weeks, and Stigmata are forgeable. Since there's no 50-50 in Honkai Impact, you're basically guaranteed a new Valkyrie each patch as long as you're maximizing your crystal income by doing all the endgame modes. Plus, if you're a new player, you literally have tens of thousands of crystals to farm from for the story. You'd easily knock out 3 Valkyries in your first patch alone. So this is actually probably the most free-to-play friendly game out of all the Hoyoverse games right now because of how long the patches are. As long as you're vigilant about doing all the endgame modes, you're basically guaranteed a Valkyrie every single patch, even if you're F2p, assuming you aren't extremely unlucky. But if you have the monthly pass as well, then you're basically set. Okay, so Honkai Impact is F2p friendly, but how is the gameplay? Well, first of all, the combat is obviously very flashy and meant to make you feel extremely strong. It's visually cluttered, but ultimately probably the flashiest combat in a gacha game besides maybe PGR. There's a huge range of characters, all of which have different gameplay. Some of them also have higher skill ceilings than others, and the combat actually does have some complex mechanics. However, Honkai Impact has one really glaring issue. It's actually too easy. Despite all the complex mechanics, you're essentially doing the same rotation over and over again. If you care purely about meta, you just search up the boss guide on Bilibili or YouTube and then copy their rotations almost exactly, and you will probably get top 100 in Memorial Arena if your Valkyries are strong enough. Now, other games like Genshin Impact and Wuthering Waves also have rotation-based gameplay, so it's not like this is just a Honkai Impact exclusive issue. The difference is that in those games though, enemy attacks, dodge timings, and environmental hazards often break up the rotation and force you to adapt. In contrast, Honkai Impact suffers from rotation-locked, low reactivity combat. Once you learn the optimal rotation and sequences, you can repeat it endlessly without really having to adapt at all. Of course, certain bosses require unique rotations or certain dodges, and I think some players will find joy in squeezing every point possible out of bosses. But personally, what I find happens really often is that I'll get really tilted if I mess up a rotation and then just give up on getting the perfect score possible. And the thing is, you get 99% of the crystal income that those top players have while spending just a fraction amount of the time and money. However, I think players can also view this as a positive. Honkai Impact is a pretty low stress game if you only care about getting as much Valkyries as possible, as well as getting the most crystals possible. And I know this appeals to a lot of people, including me. Otherwise, HSR wouldn't be so popular in the first place. And since Valkyries differ so much in gameplay and functionality, I think collecting a bunch of characters does help to break up the monotony of the rotation-based gameplay. The Honkai Impact events also have casual game modes that completely differ from the usual gameplay. And I think this is because Hoyoverse knows that Honkai Impact's gameplay can be monotonous at times, so these events serve as a way to break up the monotony. Overall, I think Honkai Impact's gameplay is pretty low stress and not too complex, but it does have a decently high skill ceiling if you want to get the best score on every boss possible. However, because Honkai Impact's patches are now 9 weeks long and not 6 weeks long, what often happens is that these events don't last for long enough to make up the entire patch, so there's a large period of time where all you do every week is just Memorial Arena, Abyss, and Elysian Realm, and that can definitely get really monotonous. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the story. The story is probably one of the best parts about Honkai Impact. There's a lot of world building that goes into it, as well as a lot of side plots that are actually really important and come up later on. There's even a pretty expansive manga series on the game itself. It's a pretty slow burn story with a really high emotional payoff. The characters also have a lot of emotional depth in my opinion, especially compared to other Hoyoverse games like Genshin Impact. And I think one of the greatest things about the Honkai Impact story is that the climaxes clearly have a lot of effort put into them. The story does have a lot of bloat unfortunately, and there's definitely a lot of pacing issues as well as informational overload. but I think if you sit through it, then the payoff is huge. There were many times in the story where I felt like I connected to all the characters and I was rooting for both the good and the bad guys. However, getting started with the story can be quite difficult. Unfortunately, the first few chapters of the game is just straight up boring, and it can take a few hours for the story to start getting good. You can also definitely see Honkai Impact's age in these first few stories after looking at these character models as well. However, once it does get good, it gets really good. I still think Honkai Impact has the best animated shorts in any gacha game to this day, and I also think it has the best music out of all the Hoyoverse games. But despite all my praise, I still can't ignore the fact that there's just too much mediocre parts to the story as well, which are necessary for these high climaxes, but can still feel draining to sit through. There's also a lot of random weird science jargon that I just don't understand, and I think the story can be really confusing at times. Part 2 of Honkai Impact also just unfortunately doesn't have the same charm as Part 1. I don't feel nearly as connected to the Part 2 characters as I did with the Part 1 characters. However, in contrast, Part 2's most boring parts are still much more digestible than the worst of Part 1's. And despite Part 2 probably having an initial higher budget, I think due to declining revenue, we'll never get the same level of storytelling that we did in Part 1. I don't think we'll ever get those high fidelity animated shorts again, and the 6-week patch change to 9 weeks clearly shows that Honkai Impact is just not as healthy as it once was. We will probably never get free art books or concerts again either, and I think it's unfortunately just an undeniable fact that Honkai Impact is past its prime. I find myself really missing the times when the Flame Chasers were the forefront of the Honkai Impact story. It really felt like there was much more depth and hype around the story. However, I don't think Honkai Impact will ever put this much money into the story again because it just doesn't make enough revenue. And unless they change something drastic out of nowhere, I do think that the game is in a decline. However, that doesn't change the fact that the story they created in the past is still here. And I think if you just want to see what the story is for yourself, Part 1 story is definitely worth exploring. But it's clear that Hoyoverse unfortunately just has bigger priorities than Honkai Impact now. So in conclusion, Honkai Impact is actually a pretty F2p friendly game that's pretty low stress. If you're just purely interested in collecting Valkyries and doing the story, then yes, I actually do think the game is still worth playing today. However, both the player base and revenue is definitely declining, and it might never be as healthy as it once was. That being said, there still is a very healthy player base that continues to post and be active about the game. However, there's also so many other gacha games out there, some of them much newer than Honkai Impact. Despite that, Honkai Impact is still a game that I deeply love, and I think that if you just want to try it, then there's no harm in doing it. It's a really fun game that unfortunately does have a few pitfalls, but overall, I think it's still a pretty solid game to this day. Hey guys, this is Bao from the future. I have made a YouTube post about this, but I just want to make it clear that my channel will be moving in a different direction. I think there's other gacha games that I'm just a lot more passionate about these days, such as Wuthering Waves and Silver Palace when that comes out in probably like 2 years. But Honkai Impact, there's just unfortunately not enough content to make on it anymore. So I want to move forward with my channel towards other games that I'm a bit more passionate about. So you will see different games from me, and I understand that many of you have subscribed for Honkai Impact only, but I hope that if you are interested in other games that I play, or maybe just interested in my kind of content style, that you'll stick around in the future. But yeah, wanted to make it official because this is a YouTube post already, but just want to make it clear for everyone. That's all. Thanks for watching, guys.